Well, it's great to be with you. Good evening. It is actually my first time on Wheaton's campus, and it's been great to be here. I would like to thank the center and Joy and Dr. Baycoat. It's really an honor to be here, an honor to be with all of you, especially on primary day. This is my third straight presidential election cycle that I've been in the Chicago area, and so I'm happy to keep that tradition going. I'm really looking forward to conversation. So I have some opening sort of comments and framing that I want to do, but really looking forward to our conversation. But I'm here today to speak about moral discernment and political participation. Come to this conversation as a Christian, as someone who's worked at the White House in 2 presidential campaigns, and as a citizen. My path to serving President Obama was not obvious. I grew up in Buffalo, New York, in a culturally Catholic family. I tell people our favorite holidays growing up, or our favorite saints growing up, were the saints associated with the best food. And so St. Joseph's Day is this weekend. That was my favorite. We had like Italian, so we had sfingi, which are like these really delicious doughy cookies, but probably not the most theologically deep way to be thinking about these types of religious commitments. My sister became a Christian. My sister is about six years older than me, and she became a committed Christian 3 years before I did, and started working on me immediately. And dragged me to her youth group at one point, and I thought I'll go and it'll give me all this great material to show her how silly all this stuff is. And on my way out of the youth group, which I didn't like, by the way, was handed a tract of Romans by a volunteer that was there. And instead of throwing it out, I took it home, read it, and it changed my life. 72 hours later in the car with my sister, after she was dropping me off from some sort of school function, told her I gave my life to Christ. And then it was like, what do I do with everything I thought, everything I thought I knew? I had civic commitments. My grandfather was a hero. He fought in D-Day. He came home, was a local committeeman, headed the local sewer authority union, an amazing man. And so I had some civic obligations. I was interested in politics long before I was interested in Jesus. But once I became a Christian, I thought, well, now that I'm a Christian, I'll go to seminary, become a pastor, because what else do Christians do? But after some thought and growing, I decided, no, I want to see what it means to be faithful in public life. What does it mean to pursue faithfulness in politics? So I went to George Washington University, and during my time there, I was supposed to be going to an event at the Washington Hilton Hotel. I didn't know this at the time, but I would spend the next 5 or 6 years of my life staffing the president at the National Prayer Breakfast at that same hotel. But then I was just in college and had the wrong date for this event I was supposed to be leading a group of students to. And so I get to the hotel, and it was my first political convention. And so I was a little naive and just kind of walked around the hotel thinking I'd open a door, and pow, there the convention would be. I finally, I'm a guy, so it took me a while to ask for directions, but I finally asked someone. They told me, oh, it's not until a couple days from now. I'm leaving dejected and defeated, and as I'm walking through the hotel lobby out towards the door, Barack Obama is walking towards me. It was a week before he announced he was running for president in February 2007, and we met. And about 9 months later, I was in Iowa for the Iowa caucus, and worked for him, starting then through May of 2013. So that journey took me from cornfields of Iowa to Chicago for his first election campaign, where I was doing religious outreach right away, to the White House, where I helped to make sure the moderate conservative religious people had a voice in outreach and in policy decisions. And then I led faith outreach for his re-election campaign. And so that's kind of the journey I took. But I want to return, for the purpose of this talk, to the question of why public life? Why politics? First, Scripture is clear on our responsibility, and our Scripture is replete with reminders of our obligations to look out for the welfare of others. In Genesis, Adam and Eve are given the responsibility by God not just for themselves, but for one another, ultimately for the welfare of creation. The Old Testament prophets reiterated and called God's people back to their obligation to work for the flourishing of others. Amos issues God's condemnation of the wealthy women of Israel who oppress the poor and crush the needy. The prophet Micah reminded us that the Lord requires of his people that they act justly and love mercy and walk humbly. Jeremiah's letter to the exiles in Babylon is, I think, probably the most instructive. These people, God's people, found themselves in a land that was not their own among a people who despised them. Yet Jeremiah's prophecy to them did not suggest that they either lie low or that they take a posture of opposition towards the Babylonians. Instead, they are instructed to seek the peace and the prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. When Jesus came, he ushered in a new ceaseless era of good news for all people, as individuals, yes, but also for the world. Near the beginning of his ministry, Jesus shocked and angered those in the Nazarene synagogue by reading from Isaiah that the Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Jesus' commission to the public square can be found in Matthew 5, when he tells us, "You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven." If we are to truly address the circumstances of the voiceless, the oppressed, and the vulnerable, we must acknowledge that while prayer and private acts of kindness and compassion are essential, an approach that only includes these things is incomplete. So many of the problems our communities, our nation, and the world face are a result of not just individual negligence, but corporate malpractice and systemic depravity. An earnest attempt to follow the scriptural commands mentioned above will include public and political as well as private approaches. As Professor Nicholas Walterstorff wrote, the pursuit of social justice and the struggle to right social injustice almost always involves politics, and politics almost always involves or should involve the pursuit of social justice and the struggle of the righting of social injustice. So the first question of moral discernment in political participation is the discernment that political withdrawal is unwise, perhaps even wrong-headed. But once we choose to be involved in politics, what then? I want to raise just a few areas that can help guide us as we make political decisions. First, humility needs to play a large role. This is a humility that recognizes we see through a glass darkly, that our knowledge is imperfect. It is a humility that is wary of a politics that promises to solve all of our problems or that makes enemies of our political opponents. This is humility as commonly discussed, but not sufficiently embraced, that recognizes our own imperfections and acts in light of them. This is critical. But I have recently become interested in the other side of humility. That is, once we recognize the limitations of our power and our knowledge, that should free us up to act, knowing that our role is not to save the world, but to have a faithful presence in it. There is a specific lack of humility in the individualistic politics of our day that prioritizes one's own perceived righteousness at the expense of political involvement and partnerships, commitments that could actually better serve our neighbors. This is what I've called a distortion of holiness. And I don't think it's better seen anywhere than with what is happening with our political parties right now. We have the highest number of registered political independents in this country of any time in our modern history. 41% of Americans are political independents. And there's a lot of rhetoric that sort of goes around this. These are folks who, can't find themselves in either party, or kind of their consciences won't allow them to do it. It's the parties have failed them, and in some ways they have. Our parties are terribly disappointing. I think we're terribly, that's the hard thing about our politics, is that our politics is a reflection of us. When people say, let Rome burn, Rome is us. G.K. Chesterton, and just as an aside, I don't know if you've noticed this, I always say J.K. Chesterton. And so I've always imagined him saying the profound things he says, and then just saying, just kidding at the end of it. And so he has this great quote. He said that men did not love Rome because she was great. Rome was great because men loved her. Just kidding. What he means is that our political commitments, our civic commitments, our commitments to one another actually transcend how great we are. I don't love my wife because she's great. She is, but I love her even when she's not great, which I never noticed or mentioned in the first place. And so, listen, so part of the game is that we withdraw from political parties, and then we critique them as if only they would get right, then they'd be good enough for us to join them. But we wonder why our political parties are so polarized. And part of the answer, a huge part of the answer, I think, is that 41% of the American people, the 41% that don't find themselves in either party, have withdrawn from the process. Who is left in these political parties but people who ascribe to every single part of the political platform? And so we have actually withdrawn the levers of influence and pressure from inside of the parties that could actually moderate or temper their views. There is nothing that the Democratic Party needs right now more than faithful Christians who are happy to call themselves Democrats, who are telling the party that they're wrong on the issue of abortion. There is nothing the Republican Party needs right now more than faithful Christians who are happy to call themselves Republicans, but are telling the Republican Party that they need to pursue sensible immigration reform because God loves a stranger. Those voices are gone. They've checked out of the process. That is not what we need to think about that. By checking out, we're not absolving ourselves of our responsibility. So if the first theme of moral discernment in politics is humility, the second is commitment. Commitment in our political system, through parties, and through civic organizations that are involved in political advocacy. So we don't have to be directly engaged personally all the time on every issue with our political leaders. There are great advocacy organizations that do this work. There are organizations like World Vision and World Relief that have a presence in DC. And these are mediating institutions that actually we can put our influence behind their work. And this political involvement should not merely serve our own interests, but take into consideration the current political moment and needs of our neighbors. These considerations will obviously be filtered through our particular experiences and passions, and that's okay. The question is, are our minds being transformed by Christ? The parochial invocation of certain principles, only to turn on those principles when deemed inconvenient, undermines our political witness. I have deep concerns about the state and future of religious freedom in this country. I believe religious freedom, the sense that religious people have the ability to fully live out their faith as full members of the American family, that sense is immensely important. I believe there are real pressures on the religious freedom of Christians in this country that will grow in the years to come. But religious freedom can't be just for Christians. We cannot protest for our religious freedom one day and protest against the mosque opening up down the street the next. Not only does that undermine our witness in politics, it undermines religious freedom. It turns it into a political football. And we must consider the demands of shared justice, not just parochial interests, in our political advocacy. And so humility, commitment, shared justice. Fourth, this idea of faithfulness is essential. And I want to just focus on one aspect of faithfulness in politics, which is that faithfulness means that victory can't be our ultimate pursuit in politics. There are tools in our political toolbox that for Christians are just off limits. The ends do not justify the means for Christians. There is no victory in politics that God needs or wants that depends on us cutting corners or kind of making arguments that are inconsistent with His Spirit. Faithfulness means that we are held to a different standard. This is very hard to. It means that we'll probably lose more political fights than we would otherwise. But our goal isn't political victory. And it's a question of what our hope is in. And when your hope is in the right place, you can hope for all kinds of things and not sort of be thrown into despair with each political kind of malfunction that occurs. So faithfulness is essential. And then just finally, I just want to talk about a joyful confidence. Dallas Willard, who's influenced me greatly, has said that joy, he defines joy as a pervasive sense of well-being. How many of you would define or describe or characterize our current political debate as being having a sense of a pervasive well-being? It's just right. I mean, that sounds silly. Everything is despair and fear and hope that sort of with just one more political tweak, the future we seek is just right within our grasp. Our joyful confidence is one that projects hope. This is a hope that N.T. Wright spoke of when he wrote that confessing Jesus as the ascended and coming Lord frees us up from needing to pretend that this or that program or leader has the key to utopia, if only we would elect him or her. Equally, it frees up our corporate life from the despair that comes when we realize that once again our political systems let us down. As shallow as our political discourse can seem at times, its impact is broad and deep, particularly for the vulnerable. A culture more concerned with justice, virtue, and compassion will definitely have a positive impact on our politics, but it's no replacement for direct political engagement. Moral discernment in politics is extremely difficult. It's not simple. We will falter. Yet we serve a God who has a claim on our whole life, and we worship a Savior who is redeeming all things. God is not confused by our politics. He's not scrambling to figure things out. We can enter the public square with humility, faithfulness, and a joyful confidence, ready for commitment, committed to share justice, knowing He is with us. We can bring all of this to Him as we seek to be faithful in politics today, as we seek to be faithful in all that we do. Thank you very much looking forward to our conversation. Thank you. Great. Dr. Bako.
So you were talking about not cutting corners.
Yeah.
Sometimes people say that I got involved in politics and then I discovered that it was so corrupt, local politics or something, right?
Yeah.
that I just decided to get out because I couldn't do it. I wasn't going to play these games. And so she's heard this many times. What is your response to that kind of personal experience policy?
Yeah. So depends on what the person's lived experience is. I have no doubt that there are some people who have been put in positions where the choice was between sort of a severe moral compromise or sort of derelict of duty, and you know, leave that kind of thing up to individual conscience and discernment. In general, public service can be a great thing, and it is a great thing. So I worked in the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, and some of my work was taken up by the latest controversial headline that came up. But 80% of my time was making sure that nonprofits had the information that they needed to do their work, that we were providing resources to nonprofits, financial and non-financial, that help them do their work better, making sure that, for instance, an adoption service agency in California was connected with an adoption agency in North Carolina so that they could figure out best practices and we could better the services that were being provided. I worked in an apparatus, the Faith-Based Initiative, that has dozens and dozens of staff across the federal government, that this is the policy work that they do each and every day. And there are folks across the government who, listen, the politics that we see on CNN and Fox News and whatever, that is not what takes up the time of government employees, especially folks outside the White House. It's just, there's incredible work to advance justice and provide order that happens under all administrations. And so we need to recover a realistic sense that doesn't idealize or idolize public service, but that doesn't buy into sort of some of the false narratives you hear. As far as political campaigns, so when I went to lead faith outreach for the president's reelect, I sent an email to some pastors I worked with. I asked for their prayers, and I asked them to help hold me accountable for what kind of messages I was sending out. And the one commitment I made and that I held was that I never let a press statement go out. I never communicated either privately or publicly that President Obama was the candidate for people of faith. And that is unusual for faith outreach or for any outreach. My candidate's the candidate for labor. If you work at all, you vote for my candidate. If you're any type of characteristic, if you're a hunter, you vote for my candidate. How I viewed my job on the campaign was I was presenting the candidates' positions and leaving it up to individual discernment about sort of where their faith commitments led them to vote for. And so I had an individual sort of sovereignty that allowed me to do what I could. I never felt sort of inherently morally compromised. Now, I was speaking to a class earlier today. Part of that was I was protected. I was in the faith-based apparatus, so I don't have the experience. My job was communicating what the administration was doing to people of faith and reporting back to the administration what people of faith either wanted from the administration or how they responded to our actions. And so that provided a bit of a buffer. So I do think it's probably a little more complicated for those who are deciding general political strategy. In general, and that's why I said God is not sort of confused by our political system. Like our job is to be faithful in the situation where we are. Yeah, I believe, to paraphrase Dallas Willard, Jesus could work in politics and be just as faithful as he was as a carpenter, and so that's a part of how I respond. Any other questions?
Can you give an example?
And I'm sorry, just your name.
Oh, I'm sorry, Dave Larson,
Yeah,
just a community member.
great.
Not a student, I look too old. The principles that you went over, can you give an example of I'm sure local, political, elected officials and volunteers, we could identify individuals that embody them. Could you identify longstanding state or national figure or a situation that embedded these principles you're studying?
Yeah. I want to just, I'll give I believe on Thursday you're going to have Ambassador Tony Hall and Frank Wolf speaking on campus. And those are two individuals, two different political parties, who partnered time and time again while they were in Congress. Oftentimes in opposition to their political party's interests. Frank Wolf would get Tony Hall on board on religious freedom protections, and Tony Hall would get Frank Wolf on board. Tony Hall is a hunger advocate, and so programs that are politically risky for Republicans to support. Tony Hall was an ambassador for those programs, both officially as a capital A ambassador and as a lowercase, and built amazing coalitions to make sure that funding for these programs was available. Another great example is Mike Gerson will be here next week. Mike Gerson worked with President Bush on PEPFAR, the AIDS program, that again was not a politically easy thing to do, but it was out of that sense of a shared justice, out of that sense that there are some higher ideals than political party platform that drove them to support these things. It's I think of my friend Ben Odell. So Ben Odell worked in the faith-based initiative under both Bush and Obama, and he worked in the Department of Health and Human Services, which is one of the more complex faith-based offices to work in just because of all the various issues they work on. Ben Odell, when young people ask me what it looks like, and this goes to your question too, Dr. Bako, when young people ask me what public service can look like as a Christian, the first person I talk about is Ben Odell. He's someone, before I got married, he's the kind of guy, I got kicked out of my bachelor pad. I wasn't ready to move in with my wife yet, so he let me crash at his house for 2 weeks. So he was. What I mean to say by that was his public work was grounded by a deep personal faith. But in government, he worked to advance as he could President Bush's initiatives with the Health and Human Services Faith-Based Office, and then worked with President Obama, who had a pretty different agenda on issues like fatherhood and adoption. And he just looked for the possibilities. That's what hope does. It opens up horizons of possibility that just aren't there otherwise. And so those would be a few examples. There was a special moment. I don't know if any of y'all saw the young man at the John Kasich rally who I think his friend had committed suicide and he was dealing with some issues, who came up to Kasich and asked Kasich for a hug. He said he had been moved by Kasich's political campaign. And I'd urge you to just pull up that clip for a glimpse of the power of politics in folks' lives. Now, the man had some the questioner had some questionable theology around hope, but our politics can provide great glimpses of some of that which we need more of in this world. So hopefully that answers your question. Hey.
Heard that.
I'm sorry, what's your name?
Abigail.
Hey.
I heard that Michael Beaver is a religion that President Obama has been influenced by. And so I was wondering whether and to what extent Christian realism plays into your view of our participation in public life.
Yeah. So yeah, if you read his Nobel Peace Prize speech, I mean that is heavily influenced by Niebuhr. The speechwriting process was informed by Niebuhr's work, and Niebuhr is another one of these amazing guys who would. They talk about him walking the halls of the State Department, and he was people don't realize he was an advisor in international affairs and a theologian. There are a lot of people like that we just sort of don't recognize as being deeply grounded in theology and having an official public service role. I think a sense. I don't want to speak to the president's view. I think the Nobel Peace Prize speech was definitely influenced by Niebuhr. But if you read the president's interview with the Atlantic on his foreign policy, so the Nobel Peace Prize speech was at the beginning of the administration. This interview at the Atlantic, which is the most comprehensive overview of his foreign policy that we have at this point, indicated some pretty interesting deviations, I think, or at least different layers of thought that weren't there. In general, it's essential. It's essential to limiting our expectations and making sure that our view of politics is grounded in reality and not in sort of utopian ideals. And so yeah, that's. I think Niebuhr's an important voice and an important sort of counterweight to some of the more Anabaptist notions that are definitely more predominant. But I look to N.T. Wright is about to come out with a book of essays on religion and public life that I think are going to be add an important perspective on this set of issues. Hey.
Kyle Schultz, Steve Harvey.
Hey, Kyle.
It's, I don't know for everyone here, but in my circle of friends, it's kind of a game we'll play as the race continues and progresses. It's kind of like a would you rather of Trump or Clinton. To put our friends in that kind of unfortunate paradox of who do you choose. But there's a reality in who do you choose. It's kind of a narrative of it's unpatriotic not to vote. But I find myself, as we progress, saying, I don't think I'm going to vote.
Yeah.
So you talked about the 41% that register independent. So how do you practically engage as a Christian this bipartisan, either or party as we move towards the future of our country?
Yeah. Donald Trump presents a challenge to much of what I've said today. I'm writing a book on hope right now, and I've been joking that if Donald Trump wins, I'm going to have to write an epilogue that says, forget everything I said. Throw this book out the window. No, I'm just kidding. We were talking about this just earlier. what is troubling to me is the pattern of withdrawal. I do think a sort of, so I should say, and go on the record, and when I'm wrong, if they could replay this clip. I'm not sure how a candidate with a 67% unfavorable rating gets his party's nomination. And so let's see how this plays out. But in the hypothetical, there may be a presenting moment in which there is a obligation for an instance of sort of a conscientious objection. What's important is that, well, also I think I should say the bar for that is very high, and that is a question for individual discernment. And so nothing I've said here is I'm not trying to create a new legalism. This isn't a weapon for to sort of enforce an individual uniformity. I'm trying to lay out some broad principles. But we have to be very careful about that type of withdrawal from the political system. You have to, it's, it may be a point where a vote for, a lot of Christians may decide a vote for Clinton is worth it based on the choice and based on the consequences. She's not making that too easy. But yeah, but I'll just agree with you. I mean, I think it's a very difficult choice, and it shows. I mean, if there are other questions about sort of how we got to this place, I'd love to tease that out with some of you. But it shows incredible disillusionment with our political process. That I would argue, in part, is a result of the despair and disappointment that you face when you place too much hope in something that isn't built to bear that much hope. Any other questions? Hi.
Yeah, Aaron.
Hi.
There's something wrong with idealism, and I can't quite put it into words. And I'm wondering if you could help.
Yeah. Well, listen. People mean a lot of different things when they talk about idealism. What I'm wrestling through right now for my book, which is what a lot of people have wrestled through over the last century, is the lie of human progress, sort of the inevitability of human progress. That was born in the Renaissance, given full weight in the Enlightenment, and carried through, seemed like a real thing in the 19th century. Like it seemed like, with all the technological advancements at the beginning of the industrial age, it seemed like this was a real thing, that society was just going to keep on improving. The problem is that the reality was that the 20th century held in it 2 world wars, Jim Crow, and what has been a philosophical and theological dilemma, the atomic bomb, the nuclear weapon, which could not have imagined. So when he thought about the possible futures for humanity, he immediately dismissed that humanity would destroy itself because it just wasn't conceivable. With a nuclear weapon, it has to be on the table. That possibility has to be on the table, and that is a huge challenge to the idea of the inevitability of human progress. When Martin Luther King said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, that quote has gained a lot of political salience these days, to the point where it's used basically to bless any political opinion that anybody has. I mean, seriously, like, I bet if you looked, you'd have someone saying, like, support ethanol subsidies because the arc of the moral universe is. He wrote that. He was quoting a Unitarian pastor who wrote that in 1860, abolitionist. And he wrote that in a journal, I think, called The Christian Witness. And in that same paragraph, the lead up to him saying the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, the lead up to that wasn't so we got past the Voting Rights Act. It wasn't we got past the Civil Rights Act. The lead up to it was Jesus was on a cross on Friday and Caesar had thought he had won. On Sunday, he was resurrected. And then he said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And we often put the power with Caesar and not with Jesus. And that's a major problem. And we need to, James Smith, Charles Taylor, there's been a lot of important work done on this idea that we have closed ourselves in as a society, that we've removed sort of the transcendent, and it's a major problem. Now the hope in that, the opportunity for that, is that with the cover on, it's a little darker, but one ray of light could be seen so much more clearly. And so I'll give you one example. Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote this book called Between the World and Me. Had some very important stuff in it. It's a 2015 National Book of the Year award. But he completely outrightly rejects hope. He says that hope plays no role in his life. And this pastor in Anacostia, D.C., one of the worst neighborhoods in terms of poverty per capita in the entire country, wrote a response in The Atlantic, the publication that Coates writes in, and made a case for hope. And Coates read it. And so The Atlantic held a day-long conference on race. And they had a whole bunch of policy discussions and a whole bunch of panels. But the end of the conference was Coates sitting down with this pastor from Anacostia, the only religious speaker on the entire platform. Coates was being generous because it was sort of his publication. He was kind of running the show. So he just opened up with Pastor, well, what's your case for hope? And Pastor Tabiti said, my case for hope is that I believe the most perfect criminal justice system is on its way and it will be inaugurated by Jesus Christ. Right? And he said that leads me to have hope for some policy changes, but my hope is in that. And Coates goes, well, okay, that's fine, but you're a pastor. What about for those of us, we live in a diverse nation, and what about for those of us who aren't Christians? And Pastor Tabiti, who's an amazing writer, y'all should look up his stuff. He writes for the Gospel Coalition and some other publications, CT Leadership Journal. Tabiti responded, well, I want to affirm the fact that I think hope is an issue of common grace. Even those who aren't religious, they hope in something, and that hope can nurture good things. There are a whole bunch of penultimate hopes that can lead to some good things. But he said, but then I'd want to return to the fact that I don't think that those penultimate hopes can actually bear the weight of your best hopes. I believe that the only thing that could bear that weight is Jesus. And so you have this auditorium full of folks who are just talking about some of the most pressing challenges of our day. Not one mention of, I didn't fact check this, but not one, no other religious speaker. Everything was closed in with what what is just the right step that the DOJ can take, and how can we address sentencing, and all of that is crucial. But at the end of the event, they were confronted with the reality that isn't just a folk way that us Christians kind of use just to sort of comfort ourselves, or just because our parents were Christians, so we were Christian. No, we actually believe it's reality, and reality always affects our. Dallas Willard had a great quote that I think he said, reality is what happens sort of when the way that you believe things operates fails you. And these moments of sort of political despair are actually great moments to offer something better, something more real.
But how is that done? We of the public forum, and especially when I hear from young people, they're at a sense of starting to vote or already voting.
Yeah.
And what do they have to vote for?
Yeah.
They have an individual that they tell me they don't feel is truthful.
Yeah.
They have an individual that is a socialist.
Yeah.
On the other side, they have the individual that's narcissistic, crude, wealthy, I guess. And they really...
For a lot of folks, that last part would just end the argument. That would be a...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or what happens in the public forum?
Yeah.
Do we sit back? I don't believe that,
No.
like you said, that we can sit back and not vote.
Yeah. Well, so I'd say one thing that has been very interesting about how this political situation has played out is that it's led a lot of Christians with public platforms, and I won't name names, but you probably would know who I'm talking about, have decided that this is an opportunity to break from a faith that was subservient to politics and actually put politics for them in a place that's subservient to their faith. And so you have people who are using the choices there as an occasion not to worry about who's going to win, but to speak to both parties. And so you have people with deep influence in the Republican Party who have said that they aren't going to go along. I mean, they're using their influence. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I don't think Trump is going to get the nomination ultimately. Because a bunch of people are saying, no, that's not the type of candidate we want. And so that's the sort of, that's the sort of voice that we can offer. We can offer a voice that actually objects to the limitations our politics offers us. Now, what that means for voting, I mean, again, to the gentleman's, I mean, we're just going to have to see what the choice is when we have choices. I mean, Illinois voted today, and you weren't voting between Trump and Clinton. You were voting between you had Rubio to vote for, you had CACE to vote for. I mean, so that's not the choice we're faced with now. And actually, a lot of Christians voted in Illinois today and in other states to offer a different vision. And so once we get to a hypothetical matchup between a socialist and an authoritarian, then that might be a time for principled objection. It might be time for a break from sort of the political order. But I don't want to jump there, because what happens is is folks say, well, things seem pretty bad now as they are. And so they check out at the prime moment of influence, which is not what is good for our neighbors. That's letting Rome burn. And so let's not look too far ahead to a choice that we'll have to make when we get there. And let's see what kind of influence we could exert now as choices are being made that will lead to the type of election process that we see in November.
Yeah, so.
I'm sorry, just hearing. I like hearing folks' names. Okay.
Rubio actually just dropped out of the race.
Yep.
And said in his confession that he didn't want people to give into the fear.
Mm-hmm.
So how much do you think the rhetoric of fear is playing into this election, and how as Christians do we combat like our own fear, but also the fear of those around us?
Yeah. It's a great question. I think the rhetoric of fear has played a driving role in our campaign. And I have to say, not just from the folks everybody's talking about. I mean, part of what our politics has been is making people fearful of the alternative. We have a lot of folks in politics who act like they're the only responsible adult in the room. That stokes fear as well. So it's been a driving force. How do we guard against that? I think one of the ways that we guard against that, right? For Christians, it's almost it goes back to my talk about humility and sort of having a sense of security in Christ. I mean, at the base level, these are spiritual questions. The reason why our politics is so full of fear is because you have a lot of people who feel insecure. And so that would be a key thing. I am not despairing over a Trump sort of election. It is not I don't find my security in politics. That being said, you have a whole lot of folks who are looking to find solidarity with that want to know that people are not okay with what is going on in our politics right now. And so part of the way that we do that is we speak out. And we actually say that the rhetoric that's coming out of the politics, out of both parties, is not okay. That's part of what we can do as Christians, is offer a sort of a counter voice. And I'm seeing that. I think John Kasich has played a really powerful role in this election. And we'll see how that works out. I don't know, as I've been talking, how the Ohio results have come in. And so it's going to be interesting to see, as Americans, as Republicans, have more time to think about the choice ahead of them, how that resolves itself. But there's no doubt this is I think, as Mitt Romney said, this is a time for choosing. And part of the way that we can help deal with the fear is to actually not recede into the background. This is actually a time for the great temptation for Christians right now is we feel an antagonism and an indifference in the culture that we're not used to in this country. And so the temptation is to sort of respond to that by saying, especially young people, we saw the mistakes of the religious right, and we just don't want to mess up like that again, right, quote unquote. And so we just kind of say, listen, if politics is what drove our peers away from the faith, we're just going to get out of politics. Like, let's just kind of take our hands off. But the only message that sends to our neighbors is that we don't care what happens to them. The only thing that happens is that the same voices who have dominated our political conversation dominate the conversation. They're able to hold on to power for even longer. And so yeah, I think it's important that we don't let that happen.
My name is Paul. This last week, Ben Carson endorsed Donald Trump for president, as I'm sure you know. Do you see that as a good example of a moral sellout, or do you see that as a good example of someone who states that their faith is driving their focus on politics? Do you see that as a position where they're trying to influence another candidate with their faith?
SMH. Well, today it was reported Ben Carson said that his endorsement of Trump, that he would have really preferred one of the other candidates, but Trump promised that he'd have influence in the Trump administration. And so I haven't heard Carson implicate his faith in his decision-making process. Beyond that, I'm not going to comment directly on Carson. In general, what I will say is that if folks are supporting Trump because they think he is the most plausible path to victory and to power, that is exactly the kind of ends justify the means type of politics that is completely outside the bounds of Christian faithfulness. I think there are probably a bunch of Christians who aren't supporting Trump for that reason, but that's a question for introspection. And we need to not let our fear of what the alternative is if things don't go our way drive us to making moral compromises on the other end. Because again, that is not the kind of victory, that is not the kind of battle that God is asking us to wage. God is not asking us to sort of strategize our way into bringing the kingdom. He's got that completely under control. Again, God is not worried about anything God is not like running around going, what am I going to do about this Trump guy? Like that's not a conversation that's going on. And when we run around like that, we actually, what that does is it sends a message that what we say our faith is in not really what our faith is in. That's like something we like to tell ourselves in our church and maybe post on our Facebook, but we don't really believe that. And so back to your, we need to be able to honestly say, not just say as like sort of a slogan, but say it in a way that comes from integrity. That our security is in Christ. And in a nation that is so full of sort of flailing and frantic sort of energy, that security is something that, again, is the sort of ray of light that can draw attention in ways that is an opportunity that we should actually identify and see as a grace.
My name is Tiffany.
Hi, Tiffany.
I really resonated with your SMH comment. And I feel like the posture of dumbfoundedness is really common right now in our political system. And when you're recommending principled response or principled engagement, there's quite a distance between dumbfoundedness and principled engagement. It takes a lot of work to get from one to the other. And in fact, I think your point about the rhetoric of the election so far, especially in the debates, has resisted principled engagement or even principled response in response, if principled response in a kind of direct, essayistic argument and, evidence or something based response is resisted?
Yeah.
Can Christians participate in kind of artistic satire types of responses?
Yeah. I think there is a dispositional uneasiness with that type of thing among Christians that has some merit. There is a merit to sort of persistent sarcasm, which sometimes satire can veer into, that can have negative effects in our outlook. That being said, I do think that there is a role for a Christian sort of principled lightheartedness, if that makes sense, that isn't flippant, but also can have the effect of exuding a sense of security, a sense of overall well-being. Now the problem is that the outlets for that kind of work aren't really there. I don't know if there's been this new Christian satire site called the Babylon Bee that opened, that started over the next few weeks, and it'll be interesting to see kind of what happens with that. But sort of attempts at Christian humor haven't always been too successful in a sort of platformed way. But I'm hoping that that the next generation can, because of how ubiquitous sort of digital platforms have been, it offers a sort of sandbox for us to experiment in new ways. I'll just say I've been made extremely hopeful by, and it's a website that has folks from various perspectives. So this is not something I'm broadly recommending without individual discernment. But there's a website called The Toast. And the co-founder of that website actually just, who was an atheist, just converted to Christianity about 6 months ago. And the work that they're doing seems to me to be tugging on a thread that I'd like to see more people tugging on, if that makes sense. Any other questions?
So I'm just curious, also, when we think about voting, it's not only presidents that we vote for.
Right.
I mean, there's senators and representatives at all levels.
Yep.
And the place of being reminded that, at least in our country, right, we're not electing a king.
That's right.
We're electing a president. But we also have, there's a reason why we have separation of powers, why we have checks and balances, and that at least, we're not North Korea. There's a lot of things we vote for.
Yep.
Not just one person. So that frame for thinking about our voting as opposed to merely it being symbolized by really, there's more than two choices.
Yeah. And so, some people would say, I don't make this type of argument in part just because I'm not a historian. But some people would make the argument that our system of government is reflective and grows out of a type of Christian realism, a type of understanding of man's imperfections. And so that's absolutely correct. And local political engagement is actually where you can have direct immediate impact with how decisions are made. And I don't mean just like a local councilman. I'm even talking to the level of your congressperson. Mike Gerson and I were together last month, and we talked about just the value of writing a letter to your member of Congress on an issue that you are passionate about or that you have a position on. People would be amazed by how little members of Congress hear from their constituents and how far reaching out to your member of Congress can go. So there are people on Capitol Hill that their sole, what really their main job is receiving and responding to mail that members of Congress receive. And if I've been there, and this isn't sort of hypothetical, members of Congress receive 10 letters on a subject, that goes straight to the member of Congress. I actually just received my representative in the Virginia House of Delegates sent me a list of all of his votes for this quarter and how he heard from his constituents. Then the number of times he heard from his constituents broken down into the percentage of their positions on the issues, and then how the member of Congress voted. It was overwhelming. He overwhelmingly voted in favor of what his constituents reported. That's why he sends out the report. He wants to show that he's being represented. But on the vast majority of his votes also, he received 200, 250 messages from constituents. It's like get like 5, 10 of your friends together and write to your member of Congress on the foreign aid budget or on a vote on any issue that you care about, and the influence can be real and powerful. Any other questions? Hey.
My name is Salman. I'm visiting. It's clear from various questions that sitting on the sidelines is not the answer.
Yeah.
And then the second aspect that I hear a lot from Christian friends is, hey, let's pick the lesser of two evils. And so first question is, hey, is that the right way to approach that? And then I'm really happy that, I'm sorry I forget your name, but Professor up ahead, he mentioned that, hey, there's other checks and balance. Let's not lose hope.
That's right.
Not the ultimate hope, but
Yeah,
let's not lose that. We've survived, worse in the past, and let's just be thankful for those checks and balance. And one of the things, there are a lot of young people here. First question, of course, is the lesser of two evils aspect. And second is, how could these young people get involved and how could they make a difference? Because presidential election is hijacking part of the conversation, but it's not be all end all. There's so many other avenues where we could bring good change.
Yeah. Well, first, and I wouldn't. And again, some choices are different from others. But I'm not sure that from God's perspective, there's been an election that hasn't been a choice of, yeah. And that's not to disparage. I have the, I think we should all have the humility to think that if we ran for office, God might view us as one of those two evils too, right? We try and be faithful and try to have discernment, but the fact of the matter is we could be wrong. So that's what I'd say on that question. Not to dismiss sort of the fact that some choices are better than others, but just to say again, that's the kind of like that sort of careens too easily into sort of a political obfuscation. On the question of involvement, so it depends on. We're not all called to have political careers. I do think and tried to make an abridged argument that given our society and the time we live in. I'm not trying to make historical arguments that sort of duties of citizenship belong to all cultures at all times, at all places. But given the makeup of our society, civic participation, I think, is obligatory for the Christian. And so between voting and running for political office, there's letter writing to members of Congress. There's supporting the mediating institutions I talked about. So depending on what God has laid on your heart. So let me give you a great example. In January 2012, the Passion Conference packed out the Georgia Dome with 60,000 college students. They gave $3 million to combat human trafficking. The next week, I'm in a meeting in the West Wing with one of the president's top advisors, and we were talking about different issues, and I brought up human trafficking as part of my policy portfolio, something I was hearing a lot about from the faith community, and I have sort of personal passion for the issue. And I reminded the advisor, the administration had been doing stuff on human trafficking from the time the president got into office, but the president actually talked about it in his event with Rick Warren in 2008. So I reminded them of the fact that that was sort of a part of the campaign. But then I was able to pull out this article, CNN, of a stadium filled with 60,000 college students, that college students raising $3 million. And I said, look at this is pretty cool. Within 3 weeks, the president was mentioning Passion and what those students did at the National Prayer Breakfast. Within months, the president was, for the first time, holding his interagency cabinet-level meeting on human trafficking at the White House instead of the meeting being in some corridor of the State Department. And then in September of 2012, the president gave the longest speech on slavery of any president since Abraham Lincoln. And that led to a whole array of concrete policy accomplishments, reaching, at my count, my last count from the last data that was released, over $100 million of additional funds going to combat human trafficking. I mean, just amazing. And that, right? They didn't hold that event and say, President Obama, act now or else. They weren't. It was showing initiative on a public policy issue, and that got attention. And so, just being involved, and you don't have to be involved in everything. One of the most important books, in my view, that's been written in the last few years, my friend Tyler Wigg Stevenson wrote this book called The World Is Not Ours to Save. And it's a great reprieve from, I think, the burdens we feel as, especially evangelical young people, to care about sort of kind of care 110% about a different cause every week. There's sort of a social justice burnout that can result from that. And that comes from sort of misplacing who is the sort of primary actor in world affairs. And so that's why, I mean, there are a number of ways for folks to get involved. I mean, the main thing is it's just to act. Don't be paralyzed by sort of insecurity or feelings of sort of that your actions are worthless, because we live in a country that actually is pretty great compared to others in terms of funneling citizens' action into real change. Any other questions?
Follow-up-
Yeah.
Follow-up question. Actually, you mentioned I'm originally from South Asian Muslim country, and I guess follow-up question is, have you ever come in your time at the White House? Did you ever come as part of were you ever involved in something that affected Christians in another country?
Yeah. So I did a lot of work on international adoption. So in my time there, Russia closed adoption and reopened. We had to negotiate with Guatemala on adoption work. And then I also had the religious freedom issues. So I was in the White House when Egyptian Copts were under profound pressure, as they still are today. But 2010 was a tough year. And so there's not like it's not like a great like anecdote I can give you. But so our faith-based center at USAID works with international service organizations like World Vision, World Relief, Islamic Relief, Jewish World Service, and serves in countries around the world. We greatly expanded the President's malaria initiative. The President started a program called Feed the Future. The President is also trying to replicate sort of the PEPFAR movement around infant mortality. There's actually a major problem with, obviously, infant mortality, but actually kids who live past the age of 5 have, that's kind of a tipping point from what international development and health specialists have named. And so the President has put, in partnership with the faith-based office, put great sort of effort towards that. And so had a lot of interaction with amazing sort of religious voices around the world that was inspiring. We did well, here's the most important from the faith-based office perspective, which is that our foreign service, for reasons of sort of a lack of knowledge of just what the Constitution requires and what it doesn't require, and just sort of personal discomfort due to like a personal lack of knowledge about religion. Our foreign service is like notoriously bad at engaging religion and religious actors. And so during my time at the White House, we actually instituted a foreign service training program on religious engagement. And that is important because let's say we did a trip to Bangladesh. You want to provide maternal health care, as USAID does in Bangladesh, and you don't know how to work with imams. It's not happening. Like there's no entry point into communities that's sustainable unless you have a working relationship with the clergy on the ground. But the problem was that our foreign service just didn't know that they could work with the civic actors that are there on the ground, and that's a problem that's being eased. The State Department actually now has a religious senior advisor on religious affairs that they didn't have before, and that's a result of a recognition that, unlike the sort of foreign policy consensus and sort of social consensus of even just 20, 30 years ago, that God was on the outs and that the entire globe was secularizing. If anything, in the last 15 to 20 years, between the Christian explosion in Latin America and the increasing relevance of Islam around the world. Religion is here to stay, which, you know, we already knew.
Last question.
Great.
As a young person thinking through the kind of political dilemma that this gentleman explained, between the options of choosing the lesser of two evils or conscientious objectionship, do you think that there's any merit to voting for a third party as sort of a third option in terms of being self-reliant and expressing our political views as Christians?
Yeah. So for me personally, although, you know, I raise these things because I think you should wrestle through them too. On a national level, and really at any significant level in local sort of elections, non-presidential elections, there's not been a third party that's been successful. There's no third party that actually has a real plan to be successful. And so this election may be a presenting moment where that is, I think, a politically relevant choice that is not checking out of the system, but is actually saying something, but sort of a, you know, I think you just have to ask yourself, am I voting for a third party to sort of protect myself and sort of my conceptions of myself? Or am I voting for a third party for a reason that is for the good of my neighbors? And those are sort of kind of the framing questions I'd ask. Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed being with you.